off those.
So we are now live streaming, so if you don't want to be seen on our YouTube channel, you can take the video off. If you're happy to be seen and to be witnessed as being at James's talk, leave your video as it is. Again, just a couple more minutes and then we'll get underway, I think. Again, if I could also just remind everybody to mute yourself before James's talk goes ahead, that would be really good. And then I'll remind you to unmute if you want to ask questions at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we get underway? There may be one or two people who join as we go on. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Our speaker tonight is James Lowen, and I promised James that I wouldn't say too much about him and that I wouldn't go on too long in doing the introduction, because obviously he would like to do that and he's much better at doing it than I am. But one of the things I would like to say, first of all, is a really big thank you to James for coming to talk to us, because I'm sure the talk is going to be fantastic. And the other thing is that I'm not particularly keen on moths, I have to say, and I'm sure I'm going to be proved wrong on this and also demonstrated why I'm wrong. But what I have done is I thought, well, it's only polite, isn't it, to read the book, or at least to start reading the book. And I would really urge anybody to read this book. It is the most beautifully written book, and it's I don't know whether James will agree with this really, but I think it's a love story. It's a love story about his relationship with moths. It's a love story about his relationship with his daughter, who is his helper in this endeavour. And I think it's also a love story about his relationship to all his fellow moth enthusiasts, who he names and quotes in the book as well. And just to sort of tell you why I think it's a love story, and the prologue to the book begins like this. I remember the date precisely, 7th of July 2012. It was the day my life changed forever. It wasn't the day I got married, nor was it when our daughter was born. It did involve a female, but it wasn't a girl or woman. It brought a coup de foudre, a wholly unexpected buckling of the knees, an unanticipated thumping of the heart, for she was arrestingly beautiful, and she was a moth. James, I'll hand over to you.
And the amusing thing is you're probably going to hear exactly the same in about 45 seconds. Right, so that's going to be quite fun. Right, let's kick off. The screen has gone black, but in a second or so, it should be... can you see the screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Nope.
So hang on, it's like something's gone wrong in that case. Hang on, we'll be back.
Yeah.
I'm just, hang on, sorry. Something has gone slightly wrong. Hang on, I don't seem to be able to exit. Apologies for this, particularly those on the live stream. It's not normally like this. Right, share screen, share, and we'll start again. We're going to be absolutely fine now. Right, you've got a black screen, then you'll have a real screen in a second. Is that all right? Are we there?
the blue background to your book is showing now.
Absolutely wonderful. It really is a joy to talk to you about moths tonight. I mean, it's a shame I can't be with you in person. It's a shame we can't do a lot of things in person. But the very fact that we have this thing called Zoom brings great joy, because it enables me to talk to you in a way that otherwise I wouldn't be able to. And it's very timely to talk to you about moths. Personally, obviously, because I've had a couple of books out last year, but more importantly, because butterfly conservation has really got to grips with moths in the last year or so. It's a seminal publication on the right, updating work earlier in the previous decade, trying to work out what the status is of UK moths. And that followed a groundbreaking atlas, which is the book on the left, which was published just at the end of my big moth year of 2019. And in turn, these publications led to a thorough reassessment of the national status of British moths. It looks pretty ugly as a spreadsheet, but that in turn has informed the development of butterfly conservation's new strategy, which very obviously and arguably for the very first time places moths and butterflies as equal. So the organisation that is involved with the conservation of moths may not have the word moth in its title, but it is absolutely just as much about moths now as it is about butterflies. And all of this has been made possible because of an exponential surge of interest in moths and in mothing over the last decade or so. In Devon alone, the number of people who have got together their records, their observations of moths and submitted them to their county recorder surged by 75% during 2020. And during COVID, the lockdown, when wildlife watchers such as ourselves were forced to stay at home, retailers sold out of moth traps because people were buying them so that if they couldn't leave home, they could get wildlife to come to them. And there's now even a university moth challenge, which is the couple of pictures that are on your screen now. Now, who's talking to you? So I'm James Lowen. I'm a Norfolk-based naturalist who grew up just a bit to the north of you in West Yorkshire. I'm primarily a writer, and I write about the nexus between wildlife conservation and travel. These are my 13 books so far. 3 of them have won awards, a couple being travel guide books of the year that are about wildlife. And last year, there were 2 books out. The one on the right is sort of a gateway, an introduction to moths, to people who haven't really expressed an interest in moths before. It's an identification guide on the common species, but make it in a very accessible fashion. And the book that forms the title for this talk. Now, you can have a look at this date. It's the 7th of July, 2012. And Rachel sort of slightly stolen my thunder, because this was indeed the day that my life changed forever. But it wasn't the day I got married. You get pictures, you see, with my version. With Rachel's, you get the text, and that's wonderful. With mine, you get a few pictures. And it wasn't the day our daughter was born, although, again, as Rachel said, she will feature prominently during this talk. And it was a female, it wasn't a girl, it wasn't a woman, but she was a moth. And she took me utterly by surprise. She was a poplar hawk moth, to be precise. And she was shown to me by a birding friend called James Hunter, just before we went to go and see the red helleborine, a rare orchid in the Chilterns. And she was sweetly furry. She was almost velvety. She was gawkily angular. I thought of her as Darth Vader's TIE fighter in animal form. And she was wrapped in silver, and she was banded in bronze, and she was grizzled with his wonderful iron filings. And she was huge, and she was glorious, and she was utterly wrong. Because moths, and I knew this for an absolute fact, were small, brown and dull. I was like Rachel. I thought they were uninteresting. I thought they were irritating. They were eerie creatures of the night, but they remained invisible except for when somehow they came out and destroyed my suits. They were malign phantoms from another world. So for nearly 40 years of my life, my wildlife watching life, I was among the many people, roughly 2/3 of Britons, according to a YouGov survey, who routinely slander all moths as being clothes-munching, plant-destroying pests. But this popular hawk moth, it opened my eyes. She brought me to my senses. She revolutionized the way that I engage with nature. And that's a really quite powerful thing. So several years later, moths really hijacked my life. The result was these 2 books. And effectively, it's a travel narrative. It's a love story, as Rachel said, but not just about people and about moths, but about place too. It's about falling in love with Britain. And because the whole point of it is trying to challenge people's preconceptions, those 2/3 of people who claim to be moth haters, sorry, to correct their misunderstandings, to reboot our collective attitude to these much maligned creatures. Now, although they're largely unseen by most of us, moths live everywhere. So from Cornwall, that's here, this is Porthgwara, right up to the Cairngorms. I spent a year exploring British landscapes with the main purpose of coaxing these moths out from the cover of darkness and into the light. My aim was to sort of unveil these underdogs of the animal kingdom as attractive, astonishing, approachable creatures. And sure enough, with 2,500 species of moth in Britain, there's plenty of enchanting tales to talk about, from migratory feats, such as these wonderful silver wise, to mastery of camouflage, the lichen-like lever du jour, from outlandish mimicry. I mean, this is a hornet moth, but by gum, doesn't it look like an actual hornet? To missives that sort of reveal the true state of the planet. Moths are sort of winged messages. Moths are in decline, but there are also some increases. And butterfly conservation has done a huge amount to try and convey to us what's going on here. But there's more besides. So moths play a valuable service to us by pollinating wild plants and agricultural crops. So 3 studies in the British agricultural landscapes have shown that up to 45% of moths are carrying pollen around our countryside. But there's also other things too. So cells from one North American moth have been used in a COVID vaccine. And there's more potential out there besides. So how did I go about doing this? I hiked up mountains and I waded through marshes and I slept out on heathlands and I roamed by night amidst ancient woodlands. Occasionally I was risking limb and arguably life, if you're as clumsy as I am. And I was constantly on the move during this year, traveling 14,000 miles, exploring 139 locations across 27 countries, including Derbyshire, over 258 days and nights. And I was following the trails of both Victorian collectors and present-day conservationists. And my aim was to try and understand why normal people, as well as environmentalists, love what the most of the Britain apparently purports to hate. And these investigations, they revealed a sort of a heady world of criminality in the case of these burnet moths, but also controversy, of determination and daring do on the part of these Victorian collectors from yesteryear. But as a counterweight to these really quite intoxicating travels across Britain, my young daughter Maya and I, we tracked the seasons through a kaleidoscope of what turned out to be hundreds of moth species living covertly in our suburban garden in Norwich, all of which were attracted to the simple contraption of a tub fitted with a bright light and housing egg boxes on which captured moths can rest before being itemized and then released into the undergrowth. So without leaving home, my daughter and I bonded through a shared joy in what I've called the uncommon beauty of common creatures. For perhaps the greatest virtue of moths, my daughter and I learned, is their accessibility. Moths may be everywhere, from the Cornwall to the Cairngorms, but above all, they're here, living alongside us. And quite unexpectedly, I reckon, no animals may be better placed to inspire the environmentalists of the future. So what better way to spend a year of my life than exploring Britain as seen through the filter of moths? So in this talk, I'm going to start with some of the greatest hits of garden mothing, if you like, before going into the travel dimension of the big moth year. And gardens, as those who run moth traps are aware, is of course where everybody starts, and that's absolutely more true than ever in COVID times. So my daughter and I, over the year, recorded 14,000 individuals of 466 species in 151 nights in our fairly bog standard suburban gardens. So there's plenty of stuff to choose from. And on each of those 151 mornings, my daughter and I performed this much loved ceremony of moth trapping, of mothing, turning off the electricity at dawn, the nervous steps towards the trap, with pots and notebook in hand, the careful removal of the bulb and the plastic housing that prevents moths from escaping, and then heart pounding, the reverential examination of both sides of every egg tray before cataloguing those moths, releasing them into the undergrowth safely. And every time is absolutely like Christmas Day. It really is a joy. Now, the burgeoning variety of spring moth light. Oh, this is my daughter's own note. This is her notebook of the moth that we saw. The burgeoning variety of spring moth-like, in particular, provided a really quite rich vein of existence for Maya and I to appreciate and to ponder every morning before breakfast, bubble wrap with birdsong. We'd rifle through the egg trays really quite enthusiastically. And the stories that the species that we found provide stories of ecology and evolution, of conservation and camouflage that sort of transported us through many a school run. So, for example, we admire the fluffily feline pale tussock as it luxuriates with its forelegs outstretched, but we also marveled at the ability of tussock moths and other moths to produce sound when they're flying around. And that sound is designed to advertise their distastefulness to bats, which are obviously one of the key predators of moths. Meanwhile, the shag pile furriness of a male muslin moth was most pleasing to us. It's got this kind of mad professor grey hair and an orange buttercup trim. Another day, we were running around the garden, sort of to enact the charge of the light brigade, as I punningly called it. This wonderful, attractive stained glass window of a moth was quite common in our garden. Iron Prominent, meanwhile, was sort of struck me, at least, as a nightclub bouncer, stocky and swarthy, with these rusty sweat patches sort of creeping across its gunmetal wings. But then there's stories of conservation, the environment too. So this pumpkin-shaped orange footman in my own lifetime has become an astonishing 100-fold commoner. That's because it benefits from air quality improvements, which have enabled the foodstuff of its caterpillars, lichen, to flourish. And in an environment that's heaving with losers, the orange footman stands out as a winner. So this slide from Butterfly Conservation shows that. The blue is the distribution last century, and the orange is the distribution, the new squares this century. This species is really exploding across the UK. We go up to this moth called the Spectacle, which is quite a natty goth moth, arrayed in grey and black, this upstanding pinkish gingery Mohican that, when looked at front on, wears these John Lennon specks on what passes for its forehead. I remember my daughter saying, that moth can't be real, Dada. That moth can't be real because the eyes are in the wrong place. So we had a bit of discussion about that as well. And then there's the peppered moth. A peppered moth, a world famous insect living in our garden. So you may recall from biology lessons, the peppered moth exists in two main colour forms, one white with black speckles and the other relatively black with a few white speckles. And in Britain, the white one predominated up until the Industrial Revolution, at which point the melanistic morph came to the fore, ostensibly because it was less visible to predators on soot-layered trees. So this is natural selection in action in our garden. Nowadays, with air quality improvements, it's the white one that's back to prominence and not the dark one. But that peppered moth, that piqued Maya's interest in camouflage and camouflage insects. And through our garden, we spent time investigating creatures that go to quite remarkable lengths to elude detection by moth munchers, such as your robins and your blackbirds. And we find moths that look like leaves, such as this angle shades, a real Art Deco creation if ever there was one. And from leaves, we move up tree to sticks, to twigs, and we find a series of moths that compete for the accolade of best stick. So chamomile shark, not too bad. Mullein moth, getting better. This is more like a snap twig. Pale primrose. I mean, what is that? That's a piece of wood chip. That's not a moth. What's going on there? But the winner surely has to be the buff tip, because whichever way up you place this moth and you align it along a slender brush, or it aligns itself, it loses itself seamlessly by dint of being sort of buff at both tips, as the name suggests. But most giggle-worthy of all, if you're a 9-year-old girl or her dad, I have to admit, are the Bird Poo Moths. So these are splashes of black and white excrement, and these are moths that can hide in plain sight, because no self-respecting blue tit is ever going to eat another bird's dropping, and thus lime speck, pug, and various other smaller black and white moths get to survive another day. We also catch insects that split family opinion as to whether they're butterfly or moth, and one is called the brimstone. So there's a brimstone butterfly as well. Another is called the early thorn, and this prompts a whole discussion over the dinner table about what differentiates butterflies from moths. And the rightful answer, and one that will distress those 2/3 of Britain that hate moths, is basically not much. So taxonomically, all the scale-wing creatures all sit within the same order, Lepidoptera. The 6 butterfly families actually taxonomically nestle within moths, and all suggested differences really break down under a lot of scrutiny. Then there's linguistic differentiation. It turns out that English is pretty much an outlier in differentiating between moths and butterflies. In French, German, and Dutch, as this slide shows, they're basically the same. You've got butterflies and you've got night butterflies. And I would argue that moths are simply butterflies with bad PR. Or switch it around, butterflies are simply moths with good PR. And with that in mind, one balmy spring afternoon, Maya and I decided to entice to our garden a day-flying moth, and there are roughly 4 times as many day-flying moth species in Britain as there are butterflies. A day-flying moth that's glamorous of appearance, imperious of demeanour, and I reckon puts to shame pretty much every single British butterfly. I mean, conditions are perfect on that spring day for worshipping emperor moths. It's warm and it's sunny and there's a soft breeze. And we need the air to be mobile such that it wafts sex scent towards libidinal males. And in a practice that's very peculiar to most naturalists, but quite familiar to mothers, as we call ourselves, we've hung up a brick-coloured rubber bung from our washing line, and we're letting it exude the synthetically produced pheromones of a female emperor moth or an empress. And once a male catches the scent of that fake female on his wonderfully fulsome plumose antennae, he'll assume that an empress is calling her willingness to mate. And by zigzagging across the plume of scent, he'll pinpoint the source and then arrow in towards it, perhaps from as much as a mile away. Or, in this case, he'll arrow in towards us. And so he is, the emperor in all his glory, the Sultan of Spring. Now, talking of glory, it's now mid-April, and it's time to travel. So we're going to explore Britain now, seen through the filter of moths. And in the wee hours of Good Friday, my wingman for the year, a friend called Will, another friend and I drive north from Norwich to the East Scottish Highlands. And we actually plan to visit 10 days later, but a really warm late winter period accelerated Scotland's spring. And now that the main object of our trip, the magnificent moth called the Kentish Glory, was already airborne. It only flies for 3 weeks in spring. So we panicked, we rearranged lives, we got into trouble with our families, we powered north. There really was no time to lose. And our trip north actually coincided with a quite worrisome announcement about the status of Scottish moths. So Butterfly Conservation Scotland had crunched a data set of 5 million records. They'd worked out that the abundance of Scottish moths had halved in the 25 years running up to 2014. 10 times more species, they reckon, were significantly decreasing in numbers than were significantly increasing. And these plummeting populations were thought to be the result of habitat degradation, changes in land management, warmer, wetter winters, that kind of thing. But butterfly conservation has softened the chasing with case studies on 5 moths, which conservation action is underway. And that quintet includes arguably Britain's most arresting resident moth, the Kentish Glory. And that makes it a really resonant headliner for our visit. So this is a large, evolutionary, unique creature. It's the only member of its genus, but it remains Kentish in name alone. It dwindled to extinction in England around 1970. Nowadays, it clings on only in the Scottish Highlands. And here it's been benefiting from a project called the Rare Invertebrates in the Cairngorms, which is a sort of mini-Breeze-centric partnership between a variety of NGOs. And the partnership has been trialling a pheromone lure to help properly survey the moth distribution. In the second season of which, 40 volunteers discovered 71 new sites for the species, including 10 wholly new 10 kilometres squares. And knowing exactly where the moths are is absolutely key to conservation. But it also helps wildlife conservation organisations help advise landowners about how to manage their properties to benefit the moth. So it's now known, for example, that Kentish Glory lays eggs only on the youngest of birch below 2 metres height. So the idea is sort of to restore these dynamic connected ecosystems with regenerating woodland of different ages. And while we're up in Scotland, we contributed modestly to the survey. We hung out lures at a number of sites, and we also ran moth traps at the Muradinnet Reserve. And we did astonishingly well. We lured 2 males, but we also caught 25 adults in total across 3 nights, more than I've ever heard anyone catching before, including 6 in a little portable battery-operated trap, as here. Now let's have a look a little bit more closely at the Kentish Glory. It's a wonderful creature. I mean, the 2 harps for antennae, at least, sort of pay testament to the importance for the male of sensing where the female is via her pheromones. And then, I mean, just look at them. They've got this kind of ermine mantle of a High Court judge. They've got a body of russet fur. They've got these inconceivable wings, which has sort of got a horse chestnut canvas, but snow flurries and flakes. Even a black marker pen held in a toddler's hand, juddering across it. Even the odd phoenix bursting into flame with that reddish hindwing. I mean, majestic and magisterial creatures they absolutely are. So they're justifiably Britain's most widely craved resident moth. So hawk moths, I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. Hawk moths are the poster boys and girls for the moth world. And given it was one of their number that sort of seduced me to the dark side, I mean, how could I not devote a considerable chunk of the year to tracking down all Britain's resident species? I kicked off in a housing estate in Norfolk, interviewing a man who's obsessed with hawk moths as a sisterhood of captive bred death's heads batted their way around the kitchen. Quite a weird experience, I have to tell you. Next, I headed down into Dorset to understand how the Wildlife Trust there is helping return narrow-bordered bee hawk moth across parts of the county and indeed across parts of the country too. And this small hawk moth is a mimic. Indeed, it sort of turns trickery into an art form. It's fuzzily plump, it's got these transparent wings, it buzzes around by day, and it's got a taste for nectar. And there's no doubt that the 2 species of British bee hawk moth are absolutely mock bumblebees, specifically probably copying the gingery common carder bee. Back home in Norfolk, I joined Patrick Barkham, who I'm sure many of you will know, and his dad, John, who's a former Norwich academic, in a dusk vigil on the North Norfolk coast. And here, we're hoping to encounter a nationally threatened hawk moth that may possibly breed in pockets along the Norfolk dunes and coastal shingle. And sure enough, as the gloaming encroaches, we're absolutely overjoyed to run into this species. It's called the Bedstraw Hortmoth, and we watch several of them feeding on honeysuckle, all hyperspeed streaks of rose and clotted cream hovering right in front of our faces. Now, we leave them be. We don't bother with a moth trap. We've enjoyed them doing their thing. But this is a close-up of what one would look like were it caught in your moth trap. Now, on our Bedstraw Hortmoth, John Barkham, Patrick's dad, rejoiced in what he called the abundance and accessibility of many hawk moths. It's so pleasing, he said, that hawk moths are relatively common, so you can actually expect to see them. Now, I confess that when I first picked up a moth field guide, I assumed the opposite, that such fantastic beasts would never be found by mere mortals like me, starting off with mothing. But how wrong I was. Since starting mothing, I've seen 8 species of hawk moth in each of our 2 suburban gardens. So even hawk mothing starts at home, not just mothing. So we're going to have a look at a couple of them. We're going to celebrate that. First up is the lime portmoth, and because its favoured lime trees are often in urban streets and parks, it's long been regarded as a townie. And there's a wonderful book written in 1937 by a guy called P.B.M. Allen. He was an aristocrat publisher. He wrote a book called A Moth Hunter's Gossip, and he designated lime portmoth as either an aristocrat or a snob, for he invariably chooses the more fashionable parts of town. And I would say he's absolutely right, because lime portmoth is the only moth that's ever graced the patio of my sister's flat in Shishi Hampstead in North London. Meanwhile, at home, Maya and I check out the eyed hawkmoth 3-part strategy for staying alive. It's got these crumpled leaf wings with these little pseudo shadows on it, which suggests that it basically tries to hide in the undergrowth. But if it's spotted, it flashes these hind wings with this startling pair of powder blue, disconcertingly bloodshot eyes. And they've got a twin rationale. They're both designed to scare predators like the peacock butterfly, but also to direct any persistent predator's attention towards a non-vital part of the body. So if this hawkmoth loses one of its hind wings, it can still operate, it can still breathe. But if it loses its abdomen or its thorax, it's game over. Now, anyone anyone who dismisses all moths as little brown jobs, and confession, that's what I used to do, doesn't need to look any further to see the light than the elephant hortmoth. Without a moth trap, you'd never know this creature existed. And with one, you enter this gorgeous, colourful new realm. And I've yet to meet a young child that doesn't fall in love with this piece of winged bubblegum. And it's not just children either. This was the first moth that author, famous nature writer Simon Barnes, properly looked at, and he equated it to a bird of paradise. And if it's good enough for Simon Barnes, it's definitely good enough to me. Now, mid-June, which is where we are now, sees the year's first moth twitch. Yes, I know people twitch birds, but they also twitch other things. That includes moths. And it comes at the end of a day that's already been really quite heavy with hawk moths. I got up at 2:30 in the morning. I emptied one set of moth traps on the Norfolk coast, and then another set of moth traps in the Norfolk Broads. And that set contains 74 different hawk moths of 5 species. It was amazing. And whilst counting up the ides and the elephants, we heard that a Suffolk mother has uncovered a striped hawk moth at a place called Bawdsey Hall. And it's a remarkable boutique B&B where there's an amazing moth trap set up with about 10 moth traps scattered around the premises. And now all hawk moths are exciting, there's no doubt about that. But those that speak of distant climes are arguably even more so. So striped hawk moth is a desert nomad. And it comes packaged with thrills and spills. So after heavy winter rains in North Africa, populations sometimes surge such that thousands may tsunami northwards into the European spring and summer. In such years of these mass emergence, there may be hundreds in Britain. In other years, of which 2019 was looking like it might be one, it's virtually absent. So it was absolutely a moth to go and see the very moment the opportunity arises. It's shaped like an arrowhead, and it's got these amazingly long wings that sweep back towards its African origin. It's a super moth. It's an epic traveller. It's got film star looks, but amazingly, it won't prove to be the best hawk moth that we see all year. More of which later. Now, my birthday is May the 1st, May Day, and I spend May Day trying to deceive the duplicitous. Now, 1st of May is too early in spring to realistically counter any of the 15 species of clearwing moths in Britain. These are creatures that disguise themselves as wasps. But because it's my birthday, perhaps I'll be lucky if I hang out a pheromone lure. Now, rather like bee hawk moths, clearwings are mimics, and they fall into 3 camps. There's black and yellowish striped ones, a bit like solitary wasps. There's several with a black with a red band, roughly copying spider hunting wasps. And 2 species that up the ante by mimicking hornets. And the deceptive capabilities of clearwings extend beyond mere appearance. They go into behavior as well. So these clearwings, they hover like wasps. They twitch their antennae in a quite unmoth-like fashion. And the 2 hornet moths even buzz furiously. It's quite astonishing. And none other than Vladimir Nabokov, who as well as being a famous author was a great lepidopterist, none other than Nabokov lauded clearwings for having what he called mimetic subtlety far in excess of the predator's power of appreciation. Now, this century, finding clearwings, which are normally quite elusive creatures, have become much easier thanks to the commercial availability of those pheromone lures that I've been talking about. Sadly, the origin of those is actually to control pests. As its name suggests, the current clearwing can infest fruit to the level of crop failure. But as with the Kentish glory, there's an upside. So these pheromone lures can also help mothers really effectively survey new areas for otherwise clandestine species. And this has utterly revolutionized the understanding of clearwing distribution. But it isn't half a bizarre pastime staring at a rubber-coloured bung, waiting for something to happen. I mean, it's mesmeric to a certain extent, meditative even. But effectively, you come to the cusp of madness. What am I doing here? Why am I waiting until it works? And the very first time that a clearwing lure comes good, it's like magic, even like sorcery. So Ahmad, the heathland in Norfolk, my nominal quarry is a clearwing called large red-belted clearwings. This is back on the 1st of May. The first clearwing to emerge each year, one of 3 British species whose range seems to be contracting. And it's also a moth nemesis for me personally. Twice I've glimpsed it, twice it's evaporated before I could swish my net or use my camera. But this time I succeed within just 30 seconds. And it's the earliest ever large red-belted clearing recorded in Norfolk. It's the first recorded anywhere in Britain in 2019. It was the perfect birthday present. And I managed the same accolade with a species called the Welsh clearwing, which I happened to see in Sherwood Forest. We managed to see the first ones anywhere in Britain that year. A relief to know that it's still alive and well in England, as well as its namesake, Wales. And it's probably quite clear to you now that I'm really quite captivated by clearwings. And I have been since seeing my first back in 2016. When I started mothing, these takes on waspishness were mythical creatures of wonder. They were unattainable, they were untenable, they were just pictures in a field guide. But one evening, I realised that the ecological needs of one species, red-belted clear, were actually met in my own garden because I had a couple of old apple trees there. At the time, it seemed like a stab in the dark to think that it might be living in my garden because there were just 5 records in the whole of Norfolk across the previous 4 summers. But for the very first time, I hung out one of these pheromone lures in my garden, and it worked. And the catch prompted the first ever moth twitch to my garden, with 10 happy people coming around for a cuppa, absolutely over the moon of watching this moth, who then fell off their chairs in absolute astonishment when a hornet moth flew in, because I hung out a hornet moth lure as well. Now, since 2016, there's been this huge uptick in the number of clearing records, not just in Norfolk, but in the whole country. In Norwich alone, for example, red-belted clearing has now been found in gardens all over the place. And this sort of tells me about one of the joys of moths. It's just that we can so easily contribute to knowledge in a way that's hard with some other taxa, such as birds, but also that we've still got so much to learn about these wonderful insects. Okay, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I guess now, I was told off by my wingman friend Will for being sizist, because I kept on passing him these egg trays that were dusted with tiny irrelevant specks of life that were called micromoths. Micromoths, they really weren't my thing. They were too small to see. They were too difficult to tell apart. They seemed to have exclusively Latin names that were far longer than the actual moths, if you could judge by the field guide. Life was just too short for micromoths. But Will said, "Oi, James, you're being sizist. Moths are moths are moths." And we've seen this slide before, but the allocation of moth families to either micromoths or macromoths is pretty artificial. It's pretty arbitrary. Granted, as the name suggests, macros tend to be a bit bigger than micros, but this moth, the goat moth, is formerly a micromoth, and it's almost the size of my finger. And over time, my frosty attitude started to thaw. It helped that I caught a micromoth new to Norfolk, new to the entire county of Norfolk in my garden one autumn. You know, I was mainly a bird watcher. You try and seeing a species new to Derbyshire in your garden, but you can do that with moths. And I also realised that these fun-sized moths, as I would disparagingly call them, they could be lookers. I mean, look at this one. It's got these great big black sunglasses on. It's got this massive, straggly kind of 1970s pop star hair, and it's clad in this heliotrope-dotted golden cloak. It's definitely a glam rock creature, this one. And then you've got the disco-dancing green longhorn moths, you know, clouds of males bouncing up and down together to attract females. And then there's the moth madness of water veneers, which are the mayflies of the moth world. They live as caterpillars underwater, emerge as adults, swarm by the thousand for just a few hours, mate, and die. Game over. What? And micromoths also offer these amazingly mad stories. So this genus of spindle moths, it can't hear it himself, but it uses ultrasound to actually jam bats' radars. And this isn't a creature that is under a centimetre long. I mean, it's just amazing stuff. So I realised that Will was absolutely right. These micromoths really had something. So as my year clunk into gear, I made 2 resolutions. Number 1, to treat all moths as equals. Number 2, to handpick a quartet of glorious must-see micromoths to track down and to write about. And the first target was called Jeff. Now, this moth's proper name is Alabonia jeffrella, but many mothers, Steve will agree, I'm sure, revere him or her as Jeff. Jeff is a supermodel on the micromoth catwalk. Jeff is haute couture, but he occurs kind of quite widely across Britain, so he's almost available on the high street, if you like. And Jeff Jeff basks normally on hedgerows, woodland edge and scrub in late May and June. It's a morning creature powered by the first rays of sun. But my first 7 attempts to find Jeff were entirely unsuccessful. But it took until the 8th attempt, an hour after dawn in a Dorset woodland, in a shard of light sort of romantically perforating the canopy, that I glimpsed this floating gold dust, Jeff. And there were a dozen males dancing around together above the shady tangled brambles, and I was in heaven. With my eye now in, I began to encounter Jeff everywhere, even without really looking for him. He demanded my attention in a dark Kent woodland, and a random lay-by on a Norfolk dual carriageway along a pavement-flanking hedge on the outskirts of Norwich. And I watched Jeff flying at all times of the day, and even at night, not just early morning. And I realised that Jeff was the micromoth that I'd been waiting for. Now, as spring morphed into summer, we decided to track down these other mini moths. And in an old tract of old woodland, I should say, in the Wye Valley, there's a rare relative of Jeff called Oecophora bractella. And it flies only in the last hour of night and the first just before dawn. And I wish I'd read the book on this one, because I stayed up all night waiting for it, and I could easily have just gone to sleep and got up in the hour before dawn. But it was worth it. I mean, what a gorgeous creature this is. And then there's the neon striped fireball that is Bisigna procerella. I'm sorry, these things have only got Latin names. There is an English name for this one. It's nominally called Kent tubic. It was first recorded in Britain in the infamous drought year of 1976. It's still only known from a relatively few sites in Kent and East Sussex, but 2019 proved to be a wonderful year for it, and we kept on bumping into it, a number of Kent woodlands. And then there's this one, Cyanida dentalis. It's one of these moths that cannot possibly be real. It's not a paroxysm of colour like Jeff or Bractella or Bisigna. But here the riot's all about pattern. It's a complicated interplay of cream, tan and chocolate spikes and bristles, creating this sort of magical eye optical illusion that denies the very presence of invertebrate. This is not a moth, it says, but a grass seed, or a miniature wheat sheaf, or a teeny tiny hedgehog. So I ended up catching 100 of these between Kent and Dorset, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And by rights, this wonderful creature, that should be that. I've seen 4 exquisite micromoths successfully tracked down, eulogized. I've got the stories, I've released them, I've photographed them. But my plans made no account for the year's most dazzling moth find, the rediscovery in Britain of this pink and yellow gorgeous thing called Hypercalia citrinalis. It had been extinct in Britain since the 1970s. Its only outpost in the whole of the British Isles, now the Burren in the island. It was gone. But somehow in 2019, it was found alive and well back in Kent on a chalk escarpment. And it probably had never gone away. This was a glorious micromoth that was hiding in plain sight. On wonderful July evening, we caught up with its garish yellow and red sweetness, which screamed icky E numbers, but more importantly, hollered about how little we really know of British wildlife. It was a wonder, it was gorgeous, and it was tiny. Micromoths, they really had something. Okay, I mean, quite unlike Kent's chalk downlands, freshwater wetlands, they reveal nothing of their moths by day. So if you want to interrogate the habitat, you've got to get out your moth traps on overcast nights that sort of offset the inherent chill of open water. So I spent a number of nights and various early mornings in the Norfolk Broads, getting together with its specialities, exploring new areas, trying to put dots on maps, including with a veteran mother, a blaspheming Cockney RSPB warden called Micah Court. And you'll see the relevance of Cockney in 30 seconds or so. And we catch a series of exciting moths, dotted footman and small dotted footman, both broadened specialities. The latter actually only one of 4 larger moth species that weren't tracked down by the amazingly talented Victorian lepidopterists, and that's without the wonderful paraphernalia that we have nowadays. We also catch plenty of these things, which are called reed leopards, a moth whose scarcity is only just about surpassed by its physical sexiness. Okay, it looks the colour and the texture of an age-dried reed stem, but it wears this furry shawl, and it's got these forelegs sprawling forward like its namesake feline, and it's got these peculiarly rounded wings that retreat backwards interminably, and yet still somehow this preposterously lengthy abdomen still manages to protrude beyond them, sticking out like a thumb tip beyond plaster. And here's Mika Court. He says, "How can you have a body like that, James? I mean, what's the bloody point?" I apologise. Him swearing. It's Mika Court swearing. I'm merely repaying the words that he said. It's not. I would never do such a thing. Anyhow, to the west of the Norfolk Broads lies the fenland, or at least the remnants of it, the solitary 1% of what was once truly wild waters, our answer to the Danube Delta, if you like. But following 2 centuries of drainage, the fens were destroyed, being reinvented as England's breadbasket. And draining the fens was probably the single most dramatic cause of moth extinctions in Britain. We'll never know for sure quite how bounteous the Fenland Lepidoptera were. By the time that the Victorians got there with their moth trapping kit of sugar and paraffin lamps, there was barely time for them to document the species, let alone work out how many there were, before they went extinct. So arash, many-lined, reed tussock, gypsy moth, marsh dagger were among the species that joined the ranks of Britain's disappeared. So I decided to honour their passing and pledge to track down some of these Fenland survivors, even if doing so means travelling slightly outside that remaining 1 percentile of habitat. So in Cambridgeshire, I see a striking dayflyer called the silver bard, and near Peterborough, a wonderful moth called the concolorus. It's prettier than its name suggests. You might have to just believe me on that. But perhaps the most exciting quarry was a capricious rarity called the marsh moth, which was a great prize even for the Victorian collectors, which suggests it's always been scarce. And drainage sort of extinguished the marsh moth from Fenland in the 1960s. But just before it could be declared extinct in Britain, it was found, surprisingly, in Lincolnshire. And it clings on here today, albeit at just 2 coastal reserves, and it's considered nationally endangered. So every year, the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust organises a spring survey of adults, and we go up to join in this. And in this, in fact, in a whole sort of year-long quest to see rare and remarkable moths, failure constantly whispers its imminence. Bad weather, early flight season, late emergence, poor choice of trapping site, elusive species, all unite to render the task at best uncertain. So it's when we arrive on a blustery, cold May evening, we really weren't optimistic. But boy, did we succeed. Not only did we catch 10 males, and I admit this is an understated creature that's never going to be a pin-up, it's definitely a mother's moth, but spotting 3 males running around a stem of ribwort plantain in one tiny area led us to discover a female. Now, this was actually big news. It was only the 2nd ever confirmed record of a female in Britain. The only other one was in 1948. And we took the first photographs ever of a live female in Britain, and pretty much the first photographs of a live wild female anywhere. Even better, the Wildlife Trust's handling of the female subsequently produced 25 caterpillars, and these were used to try and establish a 3rd colony. So just by little steps, you could possibly make a big difference. Now so little steps, big difference. But apart from that single female marsh moth, for many of the year's mothy ventures, the anticipation involved known unknowns. We know our target moth lives here, so it won't be a revelation to see it. The tenterhooks emanate from the unknowns of whether it has emerged, whether it will enter our traps or our nets in whatever conditions greet us in the precise evening we visit. But nevertheless, we travel with a sense of, if not exactly entitlement, then certainly expectation. But there's none of that with this moth, the marsh carpet. This is a moth of unknowns. It once united Fenland and Broadland, but it disappeared entirely in the 1940s, was feared extinct. Even now, it remains fickle to the point of wholesale unpredictability, thriving at sight briefly before disappearing inexplicably and irrevocably. And that sort of disappearance and rarity, it really is inexplicable, because the food plant, which is common meadow rue, occurs over a large part of the country. So why doesn't the moth? Now, Norfolk, it turns out, apparently and presumably remains a stronghold. But the first decade of the 21st century produced just 5 records anywhere in the county. And when I asked experienced mothers where we should try and see it so I could write about it, everyone just shrugged. Nobody knew. So I tried something entirely different. And in an effort to help butterfly conservation work out how to save this moth, I compiled recent records of marsh carpets from gardens around Norwich. And triangulating the catches, I pinpointed a stretch of quite promising looking damp meadows alongside the River Wrentham in the northwest of the city, just a mile, as it turned out, from home. And the trail led to a fish farm that was managed by the Environment Agency. And through a friend, I learned that common meadow rue, the food plant, actually grow there. And I started to get really quite excited. So we hooked up with officials from the Environment Agency and from Natural England. After much toing and froing and much on and offing, you know what government authorities are like. Unbelievably, we caught 3 adult marsh carpet, 1 in a trap, 2 in the lit windows of a building. To give you some context, nobody has caught more than 3 marsh carpets ever before in Britain, as far as I'm aware. And also, as far as I'm aware, these are the only 3 adult marsh carpets caught in Britain in the whole of 2019. But better than that, this moth is utterly glorious. It's a gently curved piece of fudge through which this kind of wonderful black licorice vein runs, each dusted with sugar. And against all conceivable odds, we found a wholly new site for one of the rarest and most poorly understood moths in the whole of Britain, just a mile from home. And the discovery set in train a relationship between the Environment Agency and butterfly conservation that, with luck, should help sort of develop a proper management plan for this most special of East Anglian moths, this most special of British moths. And it just goes to show that even inexperienced amateur mothers, people who used to hate moths, can sometimes do good. Okay, we're gonna head into woodlands now, because more than any other landscape, mothing in forests really demands nocturnal exploration. Only during the inky hours do woodlands reveal their innermost secrets, creatures that shun daylight just as much as vampires do. And among trees, the other world of night is sort of when the wildest things appear. Trunks become shadows, become monsters. But this timetabling presents problems. Woodland mothing requires sort of inverting the normal way of being. I'm someone who gets up at dawn normally and beds down at dusk. And yet somehow over time in woodland, it's at night in this sylvan realm that I learn to feel the most alive, the most connected to nature. So in Dorset in late May, we helped butterfly conservation with a project funded under the Back from the Brink initiative. We helped demonstrate that looking for adult Barbary carpets, one of England's 8 strictly protected moths, is a viable survey technique. Everyone had previously just counted caterpillars, but we catch 17 moths, apparently more than anyone has caught in a night for years. And we show that you can survey the adults as well. And then we head into Whiten Moths, the sort of the world famous ecological laboratory near Oxford. We went with Doug Boys, an incredibly talented entomologist who sadly passed away far too young late last year. We also head into the forest of the Wye Valley, where we successfully target a wonderful looking creature called the scarce hook-tip, dependent on local lime trees. But above all, we spend a huge number of nights in the depths of Kent's Alston Forest. According to a magazine about insects called Atropos, Alston is generally considered the finest locality for woodland moths in Britain, and it's absolutely amazing. Weirdly, it was overlooked by the Victorians, and its potential was only recognised during the 1930s, when it came to prominence for an array of rare breeders that were found nowhere else in Britain. Sadly, some of these have already vanished. Lesser Bell, Lunar Double Stripe, now nationally extinct, but many remain. And on one particular night that we visit, the forest is absolutely alive, and it's the most intense night of mothing I've ever experienced. We're absolutely assaulted by chaos. And by dawn, we've trapped 3,000 individuals, and every trap round brings up something exciting. Pockets clink with the success criteria of moth-filled pots. It's really hard to keep up. By dawn, we've identified somewhere near 200 species of moth. And their number include this creature, a great oak beauty, a near mythical deep forest creature, which surprisingly we find the first records for in this Alston forest. This is a creature that my wingman described as big as a plane. He was pretty large. But the moths also include scarce which is a French word which means wonder of the day. And this is a minty green lichen-strewn creature whose shadows and greenness sort of meld it effortlessly with lichen that sort of wraps its way around branches. And then there's a a micromoth called Agritera nemoralis. 20 years ago, this was thought extinct in Britain, most likely to be extinct. There haven't been records for 5 years. But since then, its fortunes have absolutely rocketed. It wasn't in Alston until 5 years ago, but we caught 30 on a single night, and the number was absolutely breathtaking. We'd have been over the moon just to catch one of them. And a few weeks later, we learned that something similar is happening with larger moths too. So we discover a new, probably breeding site for dark crimson underwing. And it's a really quite special. This creature appears to have taken southeast England by storm, crossing over from the Low Countries during 2019 and re-colonising haunts that it had lost for decades. And there's more going on in Kent. In a nearby woodland, we join a local mother to survey a population of another hooktip species, this one called dusky hooktip, which only started breeding in Britain during 2017. And all these last three stories, the little micromoth, the dark crimson underwing, and this one, they show that things change really fast in the world of moths. Since 1900, the UK has gained nearly 140 new breeding species, most of them since 1990. Their arrival expedited by the horticultural trade, also by climate change. But there's really an unsavoury side to the UK's moth balance sheet. Perhaps 50 species have gone extinct in recent times. Moreover, roughly 1 in 8 resident larger moths, more than 100 species, is categorised by butterfly conservation as being nationally threatened or near threatened. And for species where butterfly conservation could determine long-term abundance trends, 4 times as many species are declining as are increasing. And then there's this, which is for me the standout figure. In total, Britain has 1/3 fewer moths flying today than 50 years ago. We've lost so many of these creatures. Now, a few years ago, an already worrying state of affairs inspired composers Harrison Birtwistle to write a piece of music called the Moth Requiem, where voices forlornly encant the Latin names of moths past, and things really have, sadly, only got worse since then. Okay, it's just gone 6 a.m. on an early August morning, and I'm packing up after another night's mothing on the RSPB reserve at Dungeness in Kent. It's quite unsociably early for my phone to beep, which makes my mind sort of yo-yo between elation and despair. Something wrong with my daughter, or something good happening. But the message, which was this one, and the accompanying photograph, come from a local mother who asked quite rhetorically, I have to say, do I want to see this moth he just happens to have caught? Now, the image discloses a sort of boldly patterned moth, sort of drawn, if you like, by a kid with a compass and a protractor. I've never seen one before, but I know exactly what it is. It's a Tamaris peacock. It's very rare, and it's not from around here. It's a winged wanderer from foreign lands. It's only the 20th ever to have been recorded in Britain. In birdwatching terms, birders would be calling it a mega. And moth migration, which is what this part of the talk's all about, is simultaneously a wonder and a mystery of the natural world, that such fragile creatures as moths can fly huge distances, often over open water for extended periods. Really does astonish me. And it follows that for many mothers, catching migrant moths provides the most thrilling dimension to their hobby. Just as birdwatchers chart the seasons through the toing and froing of migrant birds, the first redwings in autumn, the last swallows, or the first swallows, the first cuckoos, so keen mothers sort of sniff out conditions that are favourable to the arrival of migrant moths. And migrant mothing is the art of the possible. In optimum conditions, almost anything could turn up anywhere. If opening your garden moth trap makes you feel like being a child on Christmas Day, and it does me, running traps at a site that's famed for migrants is like all those Christmases coming at once. But will Santa bring your desired presents? To find out, I spent many nights trapping at suitable migration locations in Norfolk, Suffolk, Kent, Devon, Dorset, Cornwall. I join in on the National Moth Night, which is focusing in on migration, back at Bordsey Hall, where I'd seen the striped hortmoth earlier in the spring. And we see a whole load of migrant moths thanks to these efforts and those of local mothers. So some we catch ourselves, other we see in plastic pots, which is where mothers temporarily house moths so that interested visitors can see them before releasing them safely at dusk so they can continue their journey. Some of these migrant moths are common migrants. Diamondbacks clouded along the North Sea coast by the million a few springs ago. You may recall being amongst the 600 million people who watched the Euro 2016 football final, when multiple thousands of silver wire moths were swarming around the pitch, delaying kickoff, and one even tending to the impeccably arched eyebrow of Portugal's captain, Cristiano Ronaldo. Now, some of these are really quite rare moths. This shows a plate of species that are really would excite mothers. Some would count as scarce migrants, if you like, regular species. And it's one of these that I really want to catch myself. It's called the Convulvulous Hot Moth, and I really do love hawk moths. But it drives me around the bend because I keep on finding it in other people's traps, not my own. And there's something about mothing. You want to catch your own moths. You don't want to see ones that other people have caught. It's like finding your own birds or going for a walk and finding your own plants, whatever it is. You want to do it yourself. So people on Twitter offer me advice about what to do and where. One suggests hanging out washing, because apparently convolvulus hawk moths love roosting on clothing. I don't know if that's true or not, but it worked for Kate Bradbury, so why not for me? And eventually, I don't know, the umpteenth attempt, I succeeded in a quarry on the east side of Portland Bill and Dorset, catching one after a massive storm that's come all the way from Africa, which gullied the paths into flash flood rivers. And I punched the air. Catching this beast myself is every bit as scintillating as I hoped. And I lost myself in the blackwater pools of its eyes. I took in every stripe, line and blemish along those wonderful wings with their jagged leaps and falls of the markings, and I feel complete. And as we dismantle the traps for the first time, for this last time, we lug them up slope to the car. I realise that I'm absolutely bone weary. Mothing does take it out of you. I'm exhausted by the elation of trapping my target moth, and I realise I need sleep like never before. But I don't get it. As I regain mobile reception back at the node, just by the car, I noticed an email that's come in from a Dorset moth that we'd met a couple of nights previously, and the matter-of-fact title alone made my knees buckle. Oleander Hortmoth, it said. And then when I read the email itself, my world stopped breathing. Oleander Hortmoth is peerless. It's a master migrant. This one's probably travelled 1,500 miles from Africa to reach Chris's farm. It's huge. It rivals my mobile phone for size. It's placid. It's almost plasticine. It's a rarity indeed, with many of the 120 odd British records coming from the first half of the 20th century, and relatively few since then. Now, back at Dungeness in August, I decided that I would avoid pot twitching wherever possible. It just wasn't my thing anymore, unless it's something like Oleander Hortmoth. And as an exception to the rule, it was an absolutely propitious moth to specify. So we gave up on the idea of sleep, and we drove home to Norfolk via North Dorset, via this mother's house. And when we arrive, incongruously, the moth is being shaded and semi-confined under an ice cream tub, because the guy involved, Chris Fox, didn't have a pot large enough in which to safely house it. And he removed the tub, and at that point, I gasped. Irrepressibly patterned, its sort of lysergic swirls giddy me. My eyes career forward to the creature's head before turning towards the outer edge of the upwing. And at the very front of this, there's this dark pupilled pseudo eye sort of staring angrily at me. And the colours, meanwhile, render this moth almost otherworldly. A violet bruise pours into olive, rose twists into apple green, the antennae lemon, those evil would-be eyes almost orange. And yes, those eyes. There's sort of an insidious malevolence to this beast's beauty. It's a not so jolly green giant. It's a witch doctor in invertebrate form. It's a bad trip, but it's addictive too. And I can't wrench my eyes away. It's the story of my big moth year in one single glorious animal. Now our hour is almost up, and time decrees I'm going to have to end the tale there. So sadly, there's not time to talk to you about searching for the special day-flying moths of dry areas such as the Brecks, Hertfordshire, Kent's Chalk Down and Properly, nor is there time to talk to you about Scotland's special burnet moths, black and crimson, gorgeous creatures that look pretty much all the same, but each tell unique, fascinating stories about conservation with a bit of criminality thrown in. We haven't got time to talk about the remarkable lekking behaviour of ghost moths that will-o'-the-wisps on the meadow beside a friend's garden, or indeed many other summer marvels that my daughter and I find in our garden. Sadly, we don't have time for a night or 10 on the beach, whether in Norfolk looking for moths that speak of the strand line, such as the scarce pug top left, or on the salt marsh of Bordsey Quay at the bottom for the remarkable sandhill rustic. And this is a moth that the adult moth is capable of swimming underwater. I mean, how wacky is that? And nor do we get a chance to head into Kent and find out how local conservationists are trying to stop a wonderfully important coastal shingle area from being built upon, or looking for things like the Sussex emerald. I also go on the trail of Victorian lepidopterists to rock-rich areas such as Portlandville, Avon Gorge, North Wales, seeking a trio of waves amongst other wonderful moths: Portland ribbon wave, silky wave, weaver's wave. The book also has a chapter on Heathland moths in Dorset, starring in an attempt to rediscover a moth called the speckled footman, which at the time was thought plausibly extinct. Nor is there time to relate a series of really quite fortunate encounters with the rare, the remarkable, the massive Clifton nonpareil. For decades, it was perhaps the most fervently desired moth of them all, but is absolutely in the throes of recolonising Britain after an extended absence, and very much welcome it is too. And nor can I talk to you about efforts to survey marshmallow moth in Kent, Fisher's estuarine moth in both Kent and Essex, southern chestnut and sombre brocade in Dorset, or black-spotted chestnut in Kent. And that black-spotted chestnut was the final target moth of the year after 14,000 miles driven, 139 locations explored, 27 counties, including Derbyshire again, on 258 days and nights. And although not a looker, this black-spotted chestnut was both special in itself, because it's only colonised the UK in the last decade, but also very personally resonant, because I saw it in the garden of the man who trapped the second ever record in Britain, who was the very same man, James Hunter, who introduced me to moths through that very first poplar hortmoth. And this is the thing about moths. There's never going to be an end to the wonders they afford. There's never going to be a conclusion to the issues with their conservation or bounds to our understanding of their status, their distribution, ecology. There's so much to talk about, so much to investigate, so much to help conserve. And there is, as I hope I've shown in the last hour, truly and inarguably much ado about mothing. So I'm going to stop sharing there, as long as I can work out how to do it. And I'm going to hand you back to Rachel and say thank you very much for letting me talk to you about the joy of moths. It's been an absolute pleasure from my perspective. Thank you.
James, thank you so much. I suspected it was going to be good. I didn't know it was going to be that good though. So that was absolutely brilliant. And you know what? I think I'm starting to like moths. Yes, a convert. James is happy to take questions, and so if you've got a question, if you can remember to unmute yourself, and then either of you can put the little hand up that you can get to at the bottom of your screen, or if you just put your video back on and wave your own hand, then James or I can just pick people out. I think we've got one question.
On the live stream.
Yeah, one question on the live stream, which is, Dave will tell us.
A question from Jill Williamson saying, are there any moths that are dependent on our embattled ash trees? If so, with what should we try to replace the ash trees?
Are there any moths that are dependent on ash trees?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know, I can't think of any that are exclusive to ash, and that's quite surprising. I might have to check up on that, but I can't think of any, because they would, you know, clearly their decline, they would be declining at some point in the future. I mean, there's some that, such as the white spotted pinion, which are dependent on elm, and they've clearly suffered quite considerably. I can't think of anything that's exclusive to ash. Someone else may know better, and if so, please correct my misunderstanding.
Okay, next, another question, or any comments on ash from anybody?
I think there's a few micros, isn't there, that are dependent on ash, but I can't think of any macros.
Yeah, there's a Clifton unparalleled an ash specimen, an ash species.
It's aspen and poplar, Clifton. And one of the reasons that I think the Clifton is doing so well is that aspen and poplar are planted quite a lot by roadsides now, so it's got more places to breed. If it was ash, it's now learning to survive on other trees, certainly.
Yeah, because I think I've got it in an old book showing on ash, with the larva on ash. That was from the early 1900s, you know.
Okay, so clearly it's evolved a broader suite of...
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's, unless my memory's playing tricks.
Okay, next question. Who else would like to ask something? Yeah, Sandy, can you unmute yourself?
First of all, thanks for an absolutely wonderful talk. It's an absolute joy to listen to it. You mentioned in the beginning about a moth that's been used in the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
How that was used?
Oh crikey! It's beyond my comprehension, but it's some particular cells from one part of the wing that were used in some way to develop the Novavax, I think, vaccine. I have to get back to you on the specifics. Someone did try and explain it to me once, but it's just the very fact that there are values ascribed to moths that we have only recently computed by dint of necessity. You know, what else do we not yet know about moths and their value to our lives?
Can I ask, James, you mentioned, I think, that one of the moths you talked about was predated on by one of the butterflies. Did I hear that right?
I don't think so.
No, I've just made that up. Right, okay.
I think it was the peacock, wasn't it?
So in which case, I definitely expressed myself badly. I was wanting to draw an analogy between the eye spots on a peacock's wing and the eye spots on the Hortmoth's wing. Right. So I suspect what I did was, when I talked about avoiding predation, suddenly drew in the peacock, which suggested that peacock was eating it. It'd be a pretty cool peacock if it could take a look at it.
That's what I thought. I need to check this out.
My apologies. That was erroneous implication there.
No, that's fine. But it was going to lead on just to say, and what else predates them? I mean, birds presumably, but what else eats moths?
Well, I mean, a lot of things eat caterpillars. So even hedgehogs will eat caterpillars. Bats will take adult moths. But I mean, there's a wonderful the Norfolk and Norwich Naturalist Society has the Norfolk Bat Group, who refer to the Norfolk Moth Survey as the Norfolk Bat Food Group. So there's a lovely bit of tension going on there. Yes. And I was surveying moths at a Heathen reserve last year. And I pointed out I had to be very careful where I placed the traps, because it was in a breeding area for nightjars, and clearly disturbing nightjars would be illegal. To which the response came back, well, you'll probably be feeding them, so it's all right. So I thought, yes, perhaps I need to locate my traps rather more sensitively for a different reason. But yes, I mean, moths, caterpillars are clearly part of the important part of the food chain. I think there's been a link proven between the decline of the common cuckoo and the decline of the garden tiger moth, which is one of the main caterpillars that's eaten by that bird. So if you remove some of the food, you remove some of the population of the moth munchers. So everything is connected.
I think Dave's got a question.
I remember years back going to a Greek island and being fascinated by what I thought were hummingbirds. It turned out to be moths. Do we get them in this country, and what species are they?
Yeah, it sounds like they would be hummingbird hawk moths. So it's uncanny, isn't it? You are absolutely sure that you're seeing a hummingbird because it's behaving exactly as a hummingbird would, sticking a long proboscis into a flower while hovering and moving backwards like a hummingbird can do as well. But it's the hummingbird hawk moth, and to a lesser extent the bee hawk moth that I showed a picture of as well, that do that. But it will almost certainly be a hummingbird hawk moth. Yeah, it's a hummingbird hawk moth, one wonderful creature. The guy I quoted in respect of the Lime Portmoth, PBM Allen, refers to hummingbird hawkmoths as diplomats because they zip across to and from across the channel in both directions, and they do more to promote entente cordiale than any of our ambassadors do.
Anyone else like to ask James? Oh, Steve? Yep.
Well, that's been a fantastic presentation, James. Brilliant. What's your life list? Are you keeping a life list of all the moths you've seen?
I have a spreadsheet, but I don't know the total. I was asked the question, how many did we see in this particular year? And I did want to look that up. The year wasn't about numbers. I didn't.
No.
If I'd cared, I'd have looked for leaf mines in a way. I didn't. I was after stories. But in that year, we had 1,135 species, which reputedly was the most anyone had seen in a year ever in Britain. Until it was beaten the next year by someone, because no one had ever thought of doing a year list for moths before. So I mean, with 2,500 species to go at, there's and new ones are
growing.
Exactly. You can never get bored with moth. You can never finish moths. You can never say, "Oh, I've done moths." No. So there's so much out there. There's so much diversity. It's just so exciting.
It's like I say, it's Christmas Day every morning, isn't it? Really, and it can be very difficult for beginners. I mean, what do you recommend? What was your recommendation for new people?
Well, one of the problems I learned this on my year's travels is that people were daunted by the number of species in a moth field guide. There were just too many. I remember looking at this myself. They all look the same. I've got absolutely no idea where to start. And that's part of the reason I wrote the other little field guide I did, because I organised it by season and I organised it by moths that look the same rather than by taxonomy. So it's all a bit radical, all a bit controversial. Yeah,
that's a good book to get then for beginners.
So that's designed to be a gateway. But the other thing is having a friend who does moths is always really helpful. I couldn't have got through my first summer of mothing without being able to send photos saying, "What's this? What's this? What's this?" And also someone who can show you how to run a moth trap. Where to position it. So friends are really useful. But butterfly conservation has, as I said at the beginning, corporately they're doing as much about moths now as they are about butterflies. Pretty much every butterfly conservation county branch has a little moth group, and they organise moth events. So you can go and go to a nature reserve and see the contents of the previous night's moth trap being shown around. And that's a great way to learn and get into it as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any final questions for James? Louise, do you want to unmute?
Hi, we really enjoyed the presentation. I had to laugh when Steve was asking his question, because I think he was probably talking about us. we've literally just acquired a moth trap, and which we haven't used yet, but he preempted the question which I was going to ask of any hints and tips for starting out, really. But I think Steve has volunteered himself, because he just lives.
You've got my phone number
for us to kickstart our moth discovery.
Right. Great, wonderful. I mean, you won't look back. It's just wonderful. It's gloriously lazy wildlife watching as well. You can get up and the moth trap's done it all for you. You just have to look through it with a coffee in hand or whatever. It can be really, really good.
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
So you get drawn into the other species then, don't you? Then you start doing the beetles and the flies and the caddis flies and
Caddis flies, yeah.
all the other things.
But that's no bad thing. It shows you, quite how much life there is out there. Okay, we've lost, 1/3 of our moths and countless other insects. We've still got some great stuff out there.
Mm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's
Okay, any final questions before we thank James and let him go to his Saturday evening? Anything? No one else waving at me that I can see? No, right. Well, okay, if everybody would like to unmute, if we could just say thank you again to James. It's been a fantastic talk, James. The photographs were wonderful too. It's been a joy to hear you tell us all about it, and also to leave us with lots of unexplained things so that hopefully we can go and buy your book. So thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to give James a round of applause, that would be brilliant. Thank you. And just before we finish, our next talk is in 2 weeks' time, and that's being given by Derbyshire Wildlife Trust about the reintroduction of beavers at Willington Wetlands. So hope to see you then. And James, if you want to join us, you're very welcome to, or you can see us on YouTube. All our talks are recorded, as you know. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of Saturday and a good rest of the weekend, everybody. And thank you very much and good night.